October 27, 1962, the Sargasso Sea. Inside an iron tube several dozen meters below the surface, the air temperature is close to 60 degrees Celsius. There is almost no oxygen. Men are fainting right at their stations. Carbon dioxide has reached a concentration that clouds the mind. The Soviet submarine B-59 has been out of contact with Moscow for several days. The crew has no idea what is happening above. They do not know whether war has already begun. Above them are 11 American destroyers and an aircraft carrier. They are dropping depth charges, not combat ones, signal charges meant to force the submarine to surface. But no one aboard B-59 knows that. The explosions pound against the hull like a sledgehammer striking the barrel you're trapped inside. And this is where the story begins. One that the Americans would not learn about until 40 years later. On board, B-59 is a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. Its yield is roughly equal to the bomb that wiped Hiroshima off the face of the earth. And the submarine's commander, exhausted, deafened by the explosions, convinced that the war has already started, according to the testimony of those who witnessed the events, orders the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. Launching it requires the consent of 3 senior officers. 2 vote yes. The third says no. His name is Vasily Arkhipov. To understand how a Soviet officer ended up inside a boiling iron tube off the coast of Florida with a nuclear torpedo behind him, we first have to answer another question. Why, in the summer of 1962, were thousands of Soviet soldiers issued skis? Not in Siberia, not during exercises beyond the Arctic Circle. Skis, sheepskin coats, and felt boots were loaded onto ships bound for the tropics. The soldiers were told their destination was Chukotka and the operation was called Anadir, after a river in the far northeast of the USSR. For months, the men had no idea where they were sailing. The captains of the ships were given sealed envelopes that could only be opened in the open sea, in the presence of a KGB officer. Inside was the order, Course, Cuba. Thus began the boldest military operation in the history of the Soviet Union. 85 civilian ships, 180 voyages across the Atlantic, ballistic missiles disguised as agricultural equipment, tens of thousands of soldiers disguised as irrigation specialists, all wearing identical plaid shirts that the Soviet light industry had produced in such enormous quantities that in Cuba they began to look like a uniform. American intelligence estimated that there were about 10,000 Soviet troops on the island. In reality, there were more than 40,000. But the most interesting part of this story is not how the missiles were transported, it is why. Because the version told in the West for half a century and the version that emerges from Soviet documents and memoirs are 2 very different stories. Let's begin on a beach in Bulgaria. May 1962. Nikita Khrushchev is walking along the Black Sea coast in Varna, looking south. Beyond the horizon lies Turkey, and in Turkey stand American Jupiter missiles armed with nuclear warheads, 15 of them, with another 30 deployed in Italy. Their range is 2,400 kilometers, and their flight time to Soviet cities is about 10 minutes. 10 minutes and impossible to intercept. According to the recollections of those around him, it was here, on this very shore, that Khrushchev voiced the idea from which the entire Cuban missile crisis would grow. Why do they have the right to keep missiles at our doorstep, while we have no right to keep ours at theirs? To understand his reasoning, you need one figure that is rarely mentioned in American films about the crisis. By 1962, the United States had around 170 intercontinental ballistic missiles and thousands of nuclear warheads capable of reaching the USSR. The Soviet Union, according to various estimates, had no more than about 100 intercontinental missiles capable of reaching America. Counting the total nuclear arsenal, the United States possessed roughly 27,000 nuclear warheads, compared with about 3,600 Soviet ones. John Kennedy won the 1960 election by frightening Americans with the supposed missile gap favoring the Russians. The irony was that the gap did exist, but in the opposite direction, and Khrushchev knew it. He also knew that the Americans knew it. There was a second reason, and it was called Cuba. In April 1961, the United States had already tried to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, and failed. In Moscow, there was no doubt the next attempt would involve the US Army, and Cuba would not survive it. Losing the only ally in the Western Hemisphere, the revolution that the Soviet Union genuinely romanticized, was unthinkable for Khrushchev, both strategically and personally. Thus, the plan was born. Secretly deploy medium-range missiles in Cuba, confront America with a fait accompli, and equalize the strategic balance in a single move. Khrushchev described it as putting a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants. The calculation was that the Americans would discover the missiles only after they were fully operational and swallow the situation, just as the Soviet Union had swallowed the presence of Jupiter missiles near Odessa for years. While nothing seemed amiss in Washington, an assembly line was operating across the ocean. The hatches on the ships were sealed and covered with tarpaulins. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed every vessel, and not a single soldier was supposed to be visible on the deck of a merchant ship. They were allowed up only late at night in groups of 20 to 25 people to get a breath of fresh air and then back below. In the holds, among the equipment, temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius. Food spoiled in the heat. Drinking water was rationed, and air came through a ventilation system that could not cope. This lasted for 2 to 3 weeks of travel. Several people died on the voyage and were buried at sea according to maritime tradition. In Cuba, the Soviet soldiers hidden in the holds were expected to carry out a task that military engineers still consider phenomenal. Within a matter of weeks, in a foreign country, during the rainy season, secretly deploy missile sites. By mid-October, R-12 missiles with a range of about 2,000 kilometers were stationed on the island. Washington and half of America's military bases were now within range. And besides those, there was something the CIA knew nothing about. Tactical nuclear weapons were on the island. Luna missile systems, frontline cruise missiles, and nuclear aerial bombs, a total of several dozen warheads. They were not intended for American cities. They were intended for an American invasion force. In those days, the Pentagon was preparing an invasion of Cuba involving up to 250,000 troops, and the planners assumed they would be met by conventional forces. They were mistaken. Americans would learn about this only 30 years later, in 1992, at a conference in Havana. On October 14th, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed missile launch sites near San Cristobal. From there, Western audiences know the story by heart. 13 days, the Situation Room, Kennedy announces a blockade. Although you will not hear the word blockade in any of his speeches, under international law, a blockade is considered an act of war, so White House lawyers coined the term quarantine. America surrounded the island with 180 warships and called it by a medical term. Meanwhile, in Cuba itself, a war of nerves was underway. American aircraft flew over Soviet positions at treetop level around the clock, 100, 200 meters above the ground, their deafening roar echoing over the heads of the missile crews. The pilots talked openly over the radio, knowing they were being listened to. When are we going to strike Cuba? It was psychological warfare in its purest form. Provoke a response, force the Soviets to switch on their radars, expose the air defense system. Soviet commanders received strict orders not to respond. For weeks, thousands of people sat beneath that roar, their fingers resting near the launch button without pressing it. At the same time, B-52 strategic bombers carrying thermonuclear bombs remained continuously airborne, while the U.S. Armed Forces went to DEFCON 2, the only confirmed instance during the entire Cold War, one step away from war itself. But what did the average Soviet citizen see during those strict orders not to respond? Almost nothing, and perhaps that is the most astonishing detail of the entire story. While American school children were learning to hide under their desks and supermarkets in Miami were being emptied of canned food and drinking water, there was no panic in Moscow, no long lines, no sense that the end of the world was near. Most Soviet citizens learned only years later that the country had stood on the brink of nuclear war, and only decades later did they learn its true scale. On the evening of October 23rd, at the height of the crisis, Khrushchev demonstratively attended a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. Let the West see, we are calm. At home that night, according to his son's recollections, he slept fully dressed in case he was awakened with news that war had begun. Because there was no calm, there was an exchange of letters with Kennedy in which both leaders gradually realized something terrifying. They no longer fully controlled their own war machines. On October 27th, this ceased to be merely a theory. On the very same day, the day when depth charges were exploding against the hull of B-59, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed. The order to fire was given by generals on the ground without waiting for authorization from Moscow. When Khrushchev learned of this, he was furious. War could have begun without his decision, because of the initiative of two generals beneath the palm trees. Then a letter arrived in Moscow from Fidel Castro. Convinced that an American invasion would begin within the next day or two, Castro effectively urged Khrushchev to launch a nuclear strike first if the invasion took place. Later, Khrushchev admitted in his memoirs that this letter shocked him more than anything else. The very ally for whom everything had been undertaken was prepared to burn himself and the world with him, in the name of the revolution's dignity. At that moment, according to people close to him, Khrushchev finally decided that it was time to stop. That same night, from October 27th to 28th, a meeting took place in Washington that officially never happened. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. No protocol, no press. According to Dobrynin's recollections, Robert Kennedy spoke plainly. The military was pressuring the president, and there was almost no time left. Then he delivered the key message. If the USSR removed its missiles from Cuba, America would guarantee not to invade the island, and the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would disappear within a few months. But no living soul was to know about this part of the deal. No documents, no public linkage, a gentleman's agreement on the edge of the abyss. On the morning of October 28th, the Soviet leadership took an unprecedented step. Kennedy's reply was not encrypted or transmitted through diplomatic channels that would have taken hours they might not have had. Instead, the statement about dismantling the missiles was broadcast openly over Moscow radio so that Washington would hear it immediately. The formula of the agreement was simple. The USSR would remove the missiles, and the United States would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev accepted the condition of silence regarding Turkey. In doing so, he signed the death warrant for his own reputation. Because to the whole world, and more importantly, to the Soviet elite, the picture seemed unambiguous. Khrushchev had backed down. Castro, learning the terms of the agreement from the news rather than from Moscow, was furious. Witnesses recalled that he smashed a mirror and cursed Khrushchev with the strongest language imaginable. Soviet officers in Cuba dismantled the missile sites with a feeling many later described in a single word: humiliation. In 1 month, they had accomplished an engineering miracle, and now they were loading the missiles back onto ships while American helicopters counted them on the decks. None of them knew about Turkey. The secrecy surrounding the Jupiter missile clause meant that their own army and their own country regarded the outcome as a defeat. Even though, in purely practical terms, the USSR achieved everything it had set out to accomplish, Cuba was left untouched, and in the spring of 1963, American missiles quietly disappeared from Turkey and Italy. Khrushchev had won the game and was not allowed to say so. 2 years later, his comrades would remove him from all his posts, and among the accusations voiced at that plenum would be the adventure of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The truth about that October would emerge only gradually over nearly 40 years, piece by piece, like wreckage rising from the seabed. In 1989, former Kennedy advisor Theodore Sorensen publicly confirmed the secret agreement regarding Turkey, and the narrative of the Soviet capitulation collapsed. What do you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Do you believe those days were the most tense in the history of the Cold War, and was the world truly under a real threat of nuclear catastrophe?